A human trap caught the herbivorous alien girl. She begged the carnivorous man not to eat her. The trap wasn't meant to catch a person, but someone was bleeding in it. Keith froze the moment he saw her. The synth fiber net he'd strung across the underbrush was twitching, spasming like it had snagged something desperate and alive. At first glance, he'd hoped for a root stalker, one of the armored tuber beasts that had just enough muscle and starch to be edible. But what lay tangled in the mesh wasn't a beast. It was a girl. A purple-skinned, long-limbed alien girl. She was breathing hard, tangled and trembling, the net biting into her forearms and legs. Strands of white hair clung to her dirt-smudged face, and where her skin touched the synth rope, thin trails of blood glimmered in the dusk light. Her eyes, wide, amber gold, and unblinking, were fixed on him in sheer panic. Then she whispered, voice raw and shaking, "Please, don't eat me." Keith blinked. "What?" She recoiled violently, arms yanking against the cords, her breath catching with terror. "Please don't eat me," she repeated louder, eyes glassy with desperation. "I'll be quiet. I'll disappear. Just don't eat me." He stared at her, stunned. This wasn't ordinary fear. It wasn't just about the trap or the pain. This was something deeper, conditioned, primal. She looked at him like he was death incarnate. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and sap through the low dusk mist that always rolled in after sunset on Zareth 9. Keith took a careful step forward, the brittle moss beneath his boots crackling with each movement. His fingers stayed open, non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "And I definitely don't eat people." She flinched again. Her glowing veins brightened momentarily along her neck, like a warning pulse. Her stare burned with disbelief. Her lips parted, trembling. "You're human. Humans eat flesh. You cut animals into pieces. You cook living things. I've seen the footage. I've seen the knives." Her voice cracked on the last word. Knives, like it was a sacred taboo. Keith crouched, keeping his voice calm, low. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I was trying to catch a root beast, not you." Still, her eyes never left his face. Her gaze flicked to his belt, where a sheathed utility knife gleamed in the moonlight. She recoiled, her breathing sharp and uneven. "You have one." Forksey's voice came crackling through the calm on his shoulder, dry and distinctly unimpressed. "Recommendation: drop the knife, predator. She's clearly not in the mood for butchery tonight." Keith sighed and set the blade down on a nearby rock. "Thanks for the timing, Forksey. Just doing my job. Would you prefer I play mood music while you terrify the local population?" He didn't answer. He was already moving closer, hands out like he was calming a wounded animal. Because that's what she was, starving, filthy, clearly injured. But more than that, she looked hunted. Her thin frame trembled not just from cold or pain, but from something far more personal. To her, he wasn't a man. He was a walking nightmare, a meat eater, a predator. "Please," she whispered again, "don't cook me. Don't cut me open. I've read what you do. I know what marinate means." Keith's throat tightened. "I don't do that. Not to people. Not ever." She didn't respond, but a tear slipped down one cheek. He began untangling the net carefully, speaking in soft, steady tones. "This was meant to catch food, yes, but not people. Just root beasts. Big dumb things with no eyes and edible legs. You're not dinner, all right." Still no reply. But she didn't fight him. Up close, he could see it now. Her skin was a muted violet, bruised in places. Faint patterns ran along her collarbones, like natural tattoos or ceremonial ink. A broken metal band hung loosely around her upper arm, half cracked, the side engraved with strange numbers and a logo he didn't recognize. It didn't look decorative. It looked like it had once belonged to a cage. Keith's chest tightened. The last knot finally gave way, and she collapsed into the underbrush with a soft grunt. She was lighter than he expected, unnaturally so, like her bones weren't built for heavy gravity. He caught her instinctively. Her body stiffened the moment his hands touched her, but she didn't scream this time. Still, she stared at him with the wary, hollow gaze of someone who had seen people eaten. Someone taught her whole life that humans didn't hunt for food, they relished it, celebrated it. He lowered her gently to the mossy ground. Okay, you're free. No tricks. She blinked, dazed. Her breathing came too fast, too shallow. Keith hesitated, then pulled off his outer coat, patched, sun-faded, and more duct-tape than fabric, and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't thank him, but she didn't throw it off, either. Forksy's voice returned, more measured now. Vitals unstable. Oxygen saturation low. Recommendation, shelter and nutrition. Keith nodded. On it. He scooped her up, slow and careful. She didn't resist, but her fingers curled tightly around the collar of his coat, like she expected to be dropped. She smelled like burnt leaves and fear. Her skin was cold against his arm. The walk back to the dome was silent, except for the low hum of the solar panels as the night chill descended. Zareth. 9 was technically habitable, but barely. The air was thin, the nights long, and most of the wildlife preferred its meals pre-dead. If the girl had been out there for more than a few hours, she'd been lucky to last this long, or unlucky enough to keep surviving. Keith's dome stood on a rock shelf overlooking a half-dead grove. It had once been part of a colonial outpost, back when Zareth 9 was still a line on a corporate map instead of a forgotten exile moon. He'd gutted it, rebuilt the interior to support a kitchen, lab, and hydroponic beds. He didn't need much else. Solitude had become a habit. He didn't trust easily, not after what had happened. Not after the scandal, the fallout, the exile hearings. Not after they took everything but his name and a knife set. He nudged the dome door open with his foot, sensors recognizing him and hissing quietly as the pressure adjusted. Inside, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, recycled air, faint traces of cumin and carbon. Forksy hovered near the counter, arms crossed in what could only be described as disapproval. Would you like me to prepare the emergency broth or just enter her in the guest book under unknown refugee? Possibly hallucination? Keith lowered the girl onto the cot. Start the broth. Done. ET. 90 seconds. I took the liberty of removing anything resembling meat from the shelf. Smart. He turned back to her. She was curled under his jacket now, eyes half-lidded but alert, still afraid, but watching him. Look, he said quietly, crouching beside her. You're safe here. No one's going to eat you. No one's going to hurt you. I promise. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but her throat caught. She coughed once, then again, rough and wheezing. Keith grabbed the canister of water and held it out. She snatched it from his hand and drank like she hadn't had a real drink in days. Probably hadn't. Keith sat down cross-legged beside her. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Zareth 9's twilight storms were slow and thick, charged with static and pollen and the distant howl of things that never quite showed their faces. He studied her for a long moment. Purple skin, branded metal, starved, terrified, and running from something, but still alive, still here. Keith stood, dimmed the overhead lights, and pulled a thermal blanket down from the shelf. Forksy's voice followed him as he crossed the room. You do realize this is how horror stories start, yes? Stray alien, broken collar, mysterious fear of humans. Keith didn't answer right away. He tucked the blanket around the girl's shoulders, careful not to touch her skin directly. She's not a horror story, he said at last. She's just someone who ran out of places to run. Forksy hummed. Then, dinner will be ready in 60 seconds. Try not to scare this one off. The girl didn't sleep that night, but she didn't leave either. And as Keith sat across the room in silence, watching the soft rise and fall of her breath beneath the blanket, one thought pressed in hard and heavy. Someone had taught her to fear humans like him, which meant someone had made her right too. The broth had gone cold by the time she moved. Keith sat on the floor, one arm resting on his raised knee, his eyes fixed on the quiet figure curled beneath his old jacket. The cot's frame creaked as she shifted, small, slow, controlled movements, like someone testing if the air around her would punish the slightest sound. Her long white hair clung to her cheek in matted strands, and the bioluminescent patterns along her violet skin pulsed faintly under the dome's filtered light. She was still afraid. but not paralyzed. Not anymore. The steam rising from the bowl on the nearby table had long faded into memory, leaving a layer of skin on top. The scent, mild, earthy, herbal, still hung in the air. It wasn't much, just a starch root broth with a sprinkle of kelp spice, but it was warm and, more importantly, meatless. She sat up slowly, wrapping his jacket tighter around herself. Her eyes scanned the room first, walls, corners, exits before settling on Keith. Her stare held a hesitation that didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like decision. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still rough. Keith stayed where he was. "Vegetable broth. Nothing alive. No meat. No tricks." A long pause. "You cooked it." He nodded. Another pause. Longer this time. She stared at the bowl. "Do you always prepare your food? Even the animals?" "Used to," Keith said quietly. "I don't anymore." Her gaze dropped to his belt. Even though the utility knife was gone, she could still see where it had hung. Her shoulders stiffened. "You slice them. Boil them. Eat their bodies." "I don't." "But you have." He didn't answer right away. The truth didn't leave him much room to deny it. Across the room, Forksy rolled out of his docking slot and hovered closer, his mechanical voice as dry as the desert moon winds. "For what it's worth, I haven't seen him roast anything that once had a heartbeat in months. He's gone tragically vegan. I suspect it's penance." Keith gave him a sidelong look. "Helpful. I try." She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. That alone felt like a small miracle. Keith reached for the shelf beside him, grabbed a sealed ration bar, plain, plant-based, and flavorless, and placed it gently on the edge of the cot. "No preparation. Scan it if you want. It's standard humanitarian issue. Refugee food." She took it, not quickly, but deliberately. Instead of biting it, she examined the packaging, turning it over in her hands. Her thumb paused on the barcode. Her other hand trembled slightly as she touched it to her forearm, an almost ritualistic gesture. Keith noticed the scarred skin where a worn metallic band still hung, half cracked, the edge corroded. A faint sequence of numbers etched into it glimmered in the light. It wasn't decorative, not even close. She didn't unwrap the bar right away. Instead, she said, "You didn't ask my name. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She studied him. "My name is Leora." He nodded. "Keith." Leora's eyes dropped again to the food. She peeled back the wrapper slowly. She took one bite, tentative like she expected poison or bone inside. Then another. Her jaw worked slowly, mechanically, like chewing was a chore she didn't trust yet. She swallowed with visible effort. Then she coughed. One sharp burst, hand at her throat. Keith shot up, grabbing a water canister from the table and holding it out. Leora hesitated only for a second before snatching it and drinking. Her eyes watered as she gulped it down, the collar of his jacket slipping from one shoulder. "Too dry?" he asked softly. "No," she said, hoarse. "Too fast." Her voice wasn't defensive anymore, just tired. Keith sat back down, not too close. They stayed like that for a while. No one rushed to speak. Outside the dome, the storm was building. The air took on a charged taste, faintly metallic and sharp at the back of the throat. The wind whistled through the narrow gullies of the nearby ridgeline. Zareth. 9 rarely raged, but when it did, the storms came like morning songs. Forksy floated by with an annoyed buzz. "Would either of you like tea, or shall I go hurl myself in the reactor?" Leora's head tilted slightly. "It talks." Keith gave a dry chuckle. "Unfortunately." "I can't hear you," Forksy called out. "He's a kitchen assistant," Keith explained. Or was. Now he's more like a passive-aggressive roommate with impeccable flavor judgment. "Who saved you from seasoning your apology stew with mold?" Forksy added. Keith looked back at Leora. "He means well. Mostly." She pulled the jacket around her again. "He's funny. He'd be insufferable if he had legs." Forksy beeped, insulted. "Legs are for the weak." That time, Leora almost smiled. Almost. Keith noticed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What happened to you?" Her expression fell, whatever spark had flickered vanishing into the hollows of her eyes. Silence. "Then, I ran." "From who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked around again, slower this time. Less like she was searching for an escape route, more like she was trying to understand what this place even was. You live here? Alone? Yeah. Why? Keith hesitated. Let's just say, the galaxy decided it was safer if I kept my knives to myself. She frowned, not quite understanding, but she didn't press. Eventually, she asked, do you sleep? Sometimes. Do you expect me to? I won't ask you to. She stared at the second cot for a long time. I don't sleep near humans. You don't have to. I'll stay up. You take the cot. I've slept on worse floors. You said you used to be a chef? Yeah. What did you cook? Whatever I could get my hands on. That's what scares me. He nodded slowly. I get that. Leora leaned back against the wall, knees pulled up under her chin, jacket still draped around her like a shield. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the ration bar wrapper, crinkling it softly. Keith stood and walked to the small stove, opened a drawer, and pulled out a tiny, cracked tin. What's that? She asked warily. Something I haven't used in a long time. He held it open and turned it to show her. Inside was a small pouch of dried herbs. Colorless now, but rich once. Earthy. Complex. Zephyric leaf, he explained. Back when I had connections. You can't even find this stuff on the core stations anymore. Leora's eyes widened. We used that. For rituals. I know. You've cooked with it. Once. It didn't go well. It wasn't meant for heat. No, she said, voice softer. It's meant for steam. The scent carries memory. He set the tin on the table between them. Want to try some? She hesitated, then nodded. Keith boiled a shallow bowl of water, dropped a pinch of the leaf in, and stepped back. The aroma that rose was unlike anything else. Not powerful, not loud, just whole. Like the echo of a song you'd heard as a child and forgotten until just this moment. Leora closed her eyes. When she opened them, they shimmered. Thank you, she whispered. Keith watched her. This girl who had begged not to be eaten just hours ago, now breathing in the scent of her world in a foreign kitchen on a dead moon. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Forksy's voice cut in, perfectly timed. I'll log this as a successful emotional exchange. Should I schedule trust-building exercise too? Keith smiled. Go recharge, Forksy. Unappreciated as always. The bot rolled away. Outside, the wind howled harder. Lightning flickered on the horizon. Inside the dome was still. Safe for now. But Keith couldn't shake the thought as he looked back at Leora, who now sat quietly cradling the steam bowl in her lap. Whoever she was running from hadn't caught her yet, but they were probably still looking. And now, she wasn't alone anymore. The storm broke just before dawn. Rain on Zerif, 9 didn't fall like on Earth. It drifted sideways, thick with spores and static charge, rattling against the dome panels like a slow, angry hiss. Keith stood in the greenhouse tunnel, watching the silvered haze smudge the horizon, arms crossed and mind elsewhere. Behind him, Leora slept. It was the first time she'd closed her eyes for more than a few minutes since she'd arrived. She hadn't curled up like prey this time, either. She'd taken the cot, lay back on her side, one hand resting against the water canister, the other still curled around the empty ration wrapper. She was still wrapped in his jacket. He hadn't reclaimed it. He didn't want to. Forksy hovered by the fermenter tank, scanning nutrient ratios with unnecessary flourish. You're watching the storm like it owes you an apology. Keith didn't glance back, just thinking. Trouble. I don't know yet. Forksy whirred in a contemplative tone. You've got a stranger in your home, possibly wanted by a government or a gang, or both. She's terrified of your species, doesn't eat your food, and might be being hunted by whoever put that lovely tracking collar on her. What's there to worry about? Keith raised an eyebrow. You forgot traumatized alien pacifist. My diagnostic scripts don't include optimism, Keith. He exhaled, finally pulling his gaze from the distorted horizon. She slept. Forksy paused. So she trusts you. Or she's exhausted. The difference is important. Keith said nothing. He walked back through the tunnel, past the hydroponic racks, back into the living quarters where the air was still heavy with the scent of last night's steam infusion. The tin of dried zephyric leaf sat sealed on the shelf again. A strange artifact from a culture he barely understood, and a comfort she'd clung to like a memory made real. Leora stirred as he entered. She didn't startle, just blinked, slowly adjusting to the light. "Storm woke you?" he asked. "No, I don't think I was really asleep." Her voice was husky but clear. "I was somewhere between. That's still progress." She sat up, wincing as she shifted. The band on her arm caught on the blanket and twisted. She pushed it away absently, but Keith saw her grimace. He crouched beside the cot, careful not to crowd her. "That thing needs to come off. It's half broken and rusting into your skin." "It's locked," she said. "Internally coded to pulse every few hours. I've tried to disable it before. It shocks. Can I look?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Keith gently took her arm. The metal band was thin, etched with faint script along the underside, and cracked clean through one side. Burn marks from previous shock attempts dotted her skin beneath it. His stomach turned at the sight. "This was meant to track you." She nodded. "Or to mark me. Depends who you ask." "Who put it there?" Leora looked away. "Does it matter?" "To me?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "A research vessel. Not official government. A private faction. They call themselves collectors. They take in survivors, refugees, crash-landed civilians. Pretend they're helping. And they didn't. They fed us. Gave us beds. Told us we were safe. Then they started separating us. Medical screening, they said. DNA cataloging. Questions about cultural memory, neural adaptation. And you. I was marked as non-compliant. Refused to submit to emotional response testing." Keith frowned. "What does that mean?" She met his eyes. They wanted to know how much fear a Zephyrel could process before losing self-awareness. Keith's jaw clenched. "They tortured you?" "No. They made me watch." Her voice cracked, then steadied again. "Others. Not just from my species." He stood suddenly, moved to the workbench, and yanked open a drawer with more force than necessary. Tools clinked. He sifted through the compartments until he found a pulse snare disabler, something salvaged from an old perimeter drone. "Basic but precise." "I can cut it off," he said, "but it'll trigger something. You sure you want to risk it?" Leora didn't hesitate. "Yes." He knelt again, placing the tool against the band. Her skin tensed beneath it, but she didn't move. The disabler's coils hummed softly as it synced with the collar's residual energy. 3 seconds. 2. The collar sparked once hard. Leora gasped but held steady. A loud snap, then silence. The broken band dropped to the floor. She touched her arm, wide-eyed. "It's gone," she whispered. Keith nodded, picking up the remains and sealing them in a containment pouch. "You should burn that," she added. "I will." She leaned back against the cot wall, breathing heavier now, but her face looked different. Not relaxed, exactly, but less braced. Less armored. "You believed me," she said suddenly. He looked up. "About what?" "About what they did. I've seen that look before. People who survive things they were never supposed to witness." She looked down at her hands. "Most don't believe us. They say we're dramatic, delusional, that we make it up to justify not integrating. You're not delusional, Leora. You're still here. That proves more than anything else." The wind outside shifted again. The dome creaked under pressure. Leora pulled her knees up. "How did you end up here?" Keith leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "I used an illegal ingredient. Not illegal because it was harmful, illegal because it was sacred to another species. They called it exploitation. It wasn't, not intentionally. But I didn't listen when they told me to stop. And they exiled you?" "They didn't have to. The network blacklisted me. No station would take my credentials. My investors dropped me overnight. I became a pariah with a 5-star resume and nowhere to go." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you regret it?" "Yes. But not because I lost my career. Because I lost my perspective. I stopped asking where things came from, who they mattered to. I thought if I made something beautiful, that excused everything else." Leora didn't answer right away. But when she did, her voice was soft. "Now you cook without meat." "I cook with intent." She nodded slowly. Forksy chose that moment to roll back in, clearly tired of waiting for relevance. I hate to interrupt your trauma bonding, but our sensors just picked up an aerial sweep from orbit. Keith stiffened. What kind of sweep? Infrared. Widenet. Not military frequency, but not friendly either. Likely drone-operated. Civ military hybrid. Adaptive algorithms. Someone scanning for life signatures. Leora's breath caught. They're looking for me, she said. Keith didn't move. He just looked at her and said, "Then it's good we just made you disappear." Outside, the sky flashed again. The storm wasn't over. But neither were they. The rain had softened to a whisper by morning, washing Zarif 9's scorched terrain in a layer of ash-sweet mist. The sky was still dark, but the horizon glowed faintly with the dusty orange of a second sunrise approaching behind the clouds. Inside the dome, silence stretched comfortably between Keith and Leora. The collar was gone. So was the last piece of visible control she hadn't chosen. She hadn't said much since the cut, just wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the broken band now sealed in a containment pouch, resting quietly on the edge of Keith's workbench. But something had shifted. There was no more constant checking of exits, no flinching at movement, no shrinking away when Keith stepped into the room. She didn't trust him fully, but she didn't fear him anymore. And that, Keith knew, was everything. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. 2 bowls of warm broth, his own recipe, heavily edited to be both Leora safe and edible, steamed between them. She cupped hers between her palms, breathing in the aroma like she was testing it for ghosts. When she finally took a sip, her shoulders eased just slightly. "You changed the herbs," she said. Keith nodded. "Swapped out the root oil. Too sharp. You flinched last time." "I did. Only for a second." "Your veins pulsed violet." Leora tilted her head, puzzled. "You noticed that?" "Hard not to. You glow." She didn't smile, but something flickered at the corners of her mouth. "In my culture, it's considered rude to comment on another's bioluminescence." Duly noted. A few more moments passed in quiet as they ate. Then Leora set her spoon down. "You said you used to be a chef." Keith met her gaze. "Yeah." She gestured to the dome around them. "How does someone go from cooking for whoever you cooked for to living here?" He leaned back, wiping his hands on a towel. "Do you want the polished version or the real one? The one no one prints?" Keith looked down at the table for a long moment. "I grew up in a mining colony. Dust storms, recycled water, food rations that tasted like melted rubber. My parents ran the mess hall, so I grew up watching my mother try to make protein bricks taste like something. Anything other than despair. When I left, I swore I'd never eat powdered stew again." Leora said nothing, just listened. It made the telling easier. "I got good at food. Not just good. Brilliant, some said. I studied on Earth, apprenticed on orbital Geneva, won awards that don't matter anymore. I made dishes people cried over. I believed that taste could heal anything." He paused. "Then I started chasing things that weren't mine to use." She raised an eyebrow. "There's a species, arboreal, semi-sentient, deep empathy-based biology. I found a gland that, when fermented, produced a compound that magnified memory recall through taste. It wasn't illegal to use, just sacred to them." Leora's face shifted, a slow veil of sadness falling across it. "They begged me not to use it," Keith said quietly. "I did anyway. For the experience. The story. The applause. And they punished you." "No," he said. "Worse. They forgave me. They made a public statement, offered to help me understand why it mattered. But by then, the galactic media had eaten me alive. No one cared about reconciliation. Just the headline. Celebrated chef cooks with sacred flesh." Leora let out a slow breath. "So they exiled you." "They didn't have to. My reputation died in a day. Sponsors gone. Licenses revoked. Clients blacklisted me. My name was poison. So I came here. Zarif, 9 doesn't care who you used to be." Leora watched him closely, not with pity, but with recognition. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Cooking." She shook her head. "Being known. Being safe inside other people's admiration." He thought for a long moment. "I miss matching, but I think I matter more now. Even if it's just to one person." She didn't respond right away. Then she pushed her empty bowl toward him. "You do." He blinked. She stood and walked toward the small window overlooking the garden pod. Her voice, when it came, was distant. I was raised in a Zephyr Grove, a canopy commune. We were taught from childhood that fear was the root of violence, and violence the poison of the universe. So we removed fear. We removed conflict. Everything was gentle. Everything was sacred. Sounds peaceful. It was, she said, with an ache behind the words. But we were unprepared. When the sky collapsed, no one fought back. The rot reached the canopy before we accepted it was real. The rot. Atmospheric collapse. Planetary destabilization. Climate layers folding in on themselves. It came like fog, but with teeth. It unrooted everything. I left on the last drift pod that made it off-world. She turned to him. Her expression was unreadable. We weren't taught how to run or survive, just how to stay calm, obey, accept. And then you ended up with the collectors. She nodded. They told us we would be studied to protect what remained of our culture. They said our values were rare, beautiful. Then they started pulling us apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of what made us sacred. Keith walked over slowly. Why did they mark you non-compliant? Because I asked what they were doing? Because I remembered what fear felt like, and I refused to pretend it wasn't real. He reached out, carefully, palm up between them. Leora looked at his hand. Then, with steady fingers, she placed hers in his. It wasn't an embrace, not a gesture of possession, just contact, chosen, equal. You didn't run from what you did, she said. You came here to rebuild. I ran because I was never taught another option. But I'm tired of running. Keith tightened his fingers gently around hers. Then don't. Forksey's voice crackled through the silence like a misplaced alarm. Interrupting moment of intimacy to report. Sweep drone has entered lower orbit. Visual confirmation pending. Leora's hand stiffened. Keith didn't let go. We'll handle it. She looked at him, eyes steady. You're sure? I'm not, but I'll still stand in front of you. A beat passed. Then she nodded. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, both of them understood exactly what they were holding on to. The storm passed in the early hours, leaving behind a sharp, clean silence. Zareth, 9, was still, as if the wind had scraped every edge of sound from the landscape. Inside the dome, a different kind of weather was shifting, more subtle, more complicated. Leora stood in the kitchen, squinting suspiciously at the array of tools laid out on the counter like surgical instruments. Forksey hovered nearby, projecting the word sterilized in blinking blue letters, as if that made it better. Do you always slice things so aggressively? She asked, narrowing her eyes at a serrated blade. That's a bread knife, Keith said. It doesn't even cut vegetables properly. It looks like a torture implement. It's a bad bread knife, he clarified, holding up a thinner blade. This one's for herbs. Very gentle. She tilted her head. Your tools are oddly specific. We use sun-warmed stones and leaf presses. Sometimes teeth. You cook with your mouth. We shape with our mouths. And our hands. We don't attack the food. Keith grinned. Well, we do. We attack it with passion. Leora muttered something in Zephyr that didn't sound like a compliment. Still, she didn't walk away. Instead, she stepped closer and peered at the glowing green root on the chopping board. Keith had grown it in the hydroponics tank, Zarethian twist root. Mild, pliable, almost sweet. He tapped the flat of the blade against it. Want to try slicing? She took the knife like it might bite her. Her grip was awkward, elbows too high, and she stood at least half a meter away from the counter. But she tried. She pressed the edge into the root. Nothing happened. She said, frowning. Try more pressure. She did. The root squished. Forksey beeped sharply. You massacred it. It resisted me, Leora replied, proud. Keith laughed, then reached around her carefully, his arms brushing her sides as he adjusted her hand. Here, he said, his voice closer to her ear than he meant. Pinch the spine of the blade. Use your knuckles as a guide. She stiffened for half a second, then relaxed. Slowly, her posture shifted. The next slice landed smooth and clean. Her eyes widened. Oh, she whispered. That felt satisfying. Now you get it. Leora smiled. I thought humans only liked food because it died first. He rolled his eyes. We like it because it tastes like something. Don't punish us for having tongues. We have tongues. We just don't use them like weapons. She sliced again. Perfectly. Forksy chimed in. The leaf girl is improving. I retract 17% of my prior judgments. You had prior judgments? Leora asked. I'm always judging. They moved through the recipe together. Keith sauteing fungal stalks, while Leora arranged sliced roots into a delicate spiral. She was meticulous, placing each piece with care. At one point, she adjusted one by a millimeter, then nodded in approval. Keith couldn't help but stare. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? He asked. It's a sacred act. Food arrangement is emotional narrative. On Earth, we just call it plating. She sniffed. Barbaric. He grinned and reached for the spice jar, one of the Zephyrel safe ones. A dried pollen from swordgrass bloom. It gave a citrusy scent when warmed. He shook it over the dish with a practiced flick. Leora froze. What was that? What? That motion. He blinked. It's just seasoning. I do it by instinct. She mimicked the flick of his wrist. This looks like a mating display. Is that what you're doing? Keith coughed. No, because if it is, it's working. That pollen is amazing. He turned away, laughing, cheeks flushed with the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. They sat together when it was done, cross-legged on the floor, plates between them. Keith took a bite first, chewing slowly, watching her. Leora hesitated. Then she picked up her first slice. One bite, then another. Her shoulders fell, and she made a soft noise, almost a hum. Then she hiccuped. Once. Glitter. Keith blinked. Seriously? Leora covered her mouth, mortified. I thought that stopped happening. He chuckled. It's adorable, and slightly hazardous. I'm still finding sparkle in my boots from last time. She glared at him, but she was smiling now. Her eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them. They ate in silence for a moment longer, knees almost touching, the space between them shrinking without anyone pointing it out. The storm had faded, the drones hadn't returned, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Leora looked like someone who belonged in the room. Then Keith cleared his throat. I made something else. Her eyes narrowed. What kind of something? A surprise. He stood and walked to the cooling rack, returning with a small cup of gel, crystal clear and dotted with blue seeds. I tried recreating a Zephyrel sweet, from the texture you described. Leora stared at it. You made this for me? He nodded. She took it gently, holding it in both hands. Then, in a gesture so subtle he almost missed it, she lifted her hand, just barely, and touched his wrist. In Zephyrel culture, it meant gratitude with trust. She tasted the gel. Her eyes filled immediately. I haven't tasted this since I was 13, she said. It's not right, but it's so close it hurts. I'm sorry it's not perfect. No, she whispered. I didn't mean that. I meant, thank you for trying. Keith didn't reply. He reached out, slowly, brushed a strand of her white hair away from her face. She didn't pull back. The touch lingered. His thumb rested just at her cheekbone, her skin warm under his calloused fingers. And for a moment, everything stopped. She leaned forward, hesitantly, questioning. He met her halfway. The kiss was soft, barely there, more breath than pressure, but it landed like a promise. When they parted, she exhaled. You're not like the others. I hope not. She touched her forehead to his, gently. Then Forksea's voice blared through the dome. Warning, romantic proximity exceeding baseline safety parameters. Recommend ventilation. And privacy. They both broke into laughter, but neither moved away. Because for the first time since she fell from the sky into his broken world, she wasn't afraid. And he wasn't alone. The day after the kiss was quieter than most. There was no awkward tension, no forced conversation. If anything, the silence between them had grown warmer, less like distance and more like breath. Shared, understood. They moved around each other with ease, without needing to ask what came next. Leora was the first to rise, barefoot and focused, combing through the herb shelf like it held the answers to something sacred. Keith watched her from the kitchen, letting the kettle hum while she sorted blossoms by color and scent. The glow in her hair was soft, pulsing faintly with each movement. She was humming. Not a tune, not quite. Just vibrations, long, airy chords that wove themselves into the atmosphere of the dome like mist. "You do that often?" he asked, pouring tea into 2 cups. "Only when I'm at peace," she replied, without turning. He handed her the mug. Their fingers touched briefly as she accepted it. No spark, no dramatics. Just connection. Familiar. Natural. Forksy rolled in, projecting a muted yellow standby icon on his display screen as if that excused his eavesdropping. "I'm sensing emotional stabilization in both parties," he announced. "Should I prepare the mating canopy?" Keith didn't bother replying. Leora sipped her tea and smirked. "Ignore him. He's not calibrated for intimacy." "I'm not calibrated for sarcasm either," Forksy added, "but I endure." They sat on the floor by the garden window, where soft orange light filtered through the fog glass. Leora picked at a strand of her hair, her voice calm. "I've been thinking about the sweet you made." Keith turned toward her. "I never told you the full ingredients, but you came so close. That wasn't just culinary memory. That was empathy, in flavor form." "I did some guessing," he said, "and Forksy helped me identify a few likely starch bonds based on Zephyr pollen profiles." "You guessed based on molecular starch?" "I was bored." She laughed, that rare melodic sound she didn't share freely. Then she leaned forward, pulled something from her satchel, a small, flattened seed with a woven net-like structure and a dull shimmer. "This is a soul seed," she said. "Every Zephyr is given one at birth. We plant it during rites of return, when someone chooses to stay in a place forever." Keith blinked. "That sounds serious." "It is. But I'm not planting it," she said. "Not yet. I want to grow something first. Something temporary. A trial root. Would you help me?" "With what?" "Creating a shared dish. One that belongs to neither of us, but also to both." He smiled. A cultural fusion. A promise without pressure. They worked side by side for hours, turning the kitchen into something halfway between a lab and a temple. Keith measured ferment rates, while Leora arranged petals in recursive spirals only she seemed to understand. At one point, she paused and touched his arm. "Can you taste memories?" she asked. "In a way. I want this one to taste like this moment." He nodded. By sunset, the dish was complete. A translucent jelly formed from Zephyr leaf extract and earth root gelatin, topped with spiral-cut fruit soaked in citrus mist. The texture was strange, firm yet soft, cool with a slow-burning aftertaste that lingered like affection. Leora took the first bite and froze. Keith leaned forward. "Bad." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes glistened. Then she held out the spoon. "Try it." He did. The flavor was mild at first, nothing extravagant. But then it swelled like warmth building under the tongue. Something gently euphoric. "What is that?" he asked. "It's not taste," she said. "It's resonance. Our biologies matched at the cellular level. You built flavor on an emotional frequency." He blinked. "That wasn't intentional. It rarely is." She stood, stepped closer. Her fingers brushed his wrist, then slid upward to his elbow. He didn't move. "I want to show you something," she said softly. She guided him to the far end of the dome, to the small vine-wrapped alcove she'd built from garden trimmings and glow bark. Inside, resting on a makeshift cushion, was her soul seed. She knelt, and after a moment's hesitation, he knelt beside her. "I'm not planting it," she repeated, "but I want to leave it here for now. A placeholder for what might be." Keith didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded napkin, a recipe scribbled on the back in marker. "My mother wrote this," he said. "It's from when I was 5. The first thing I ever cooked with her." He placed it beside the seed. They looked at each other, and there was no distance left between them. She leaned in. This kiss was deeper, slower. His hands rested on her waist. Hers slipped into his hair. They stayed like that, breathing together, sharing warmth and time. Forksy's voice finally interrupted, quieter than usual. Heat levels in the dome rising. Atmospheric regulators initiating a romance threshold cooldown. Neither of them moved. Later, As they curled together on the floor beneath the vines, Keith whispered, "What does this mean in your culture?" She traced a line down his chest. "It means we've begun the middle." He looked at her, puzzled. "The middle? We don't believe in endings. Only turning points." Keith smiled. "Then let's keep turning." It had been 12 days since the drone. 12 days without scanners overhead. Without static pulses through the dome. Without the cold drip of adrenaline running down Keith's spine every time a shadow passed too slowly across the solar panes. The quiet no longer felt like a warning. It felt earned. It was mid-morning when Keith found Leora in the garden, crouched over the sprouting root beds, her fingers deep in the soil. Sunlight filtered through the mist-laced air, catching in her long white hair and making it gleam like threads of silvered fire. She looked peaceful. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood at the edge of the doorway and watched her work, one hand gripping a half-peeled fruit, the other resting on the frame of the doorway. There was something magnetic about her when she was focused, like the world had narrowed down to what she could shape, what she could nurture. Then she looked up, smiling softly. "You've been watching me for 7 whole minutes," she said. "I was timing you," Keith replied deadpan, "to see if your hands would root and grow sprouts." She wiped her palms on her robe and stood, stretching her arms high toward the sun. "Give me a few more weeks. I'll outgrow the kitchen." He walked to her side, passed her the fruit. She bit into it without hesitation, chewing slowly, savoring. "Sweet," she said, licking juice from her fingers. "Too sweet. Blame the sun flare. Change the sugar content. Or you're just spoiling your crops the way you spoil me." Keith raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She laughed, leaning into his side. They walked the garden rows together, pointing out new growth, checking for pests. Leora hummed as she worked, a quiet, circular melody that Keith was beginning to recognize as something sacred, or maybe just hers. The soul seed she planted near the dome's center had grown faster than either of them expected. Now it was 1/2 meter tall, with thick, broad leaves that pulsed with a soft glow, almost like it breathed with them. She knelt beside it, tracing a hand over one of the leaves, then looked up. "It's taking root," she said. "So have you," Keith replied. She tilted her head, considering him. "I think I did the moment you made me glitter hiccup." They laughed again, the way people do when there's no fear of being overheard. When even the silence around them feels like part of their shared story. Back inside, Forksy announced that he'd reorganized the pantry, according to planetary logic, and now could no longer find anything. Keith grumbled, Leora pretended to scold, and together they cooked a stew with a base of crushed twist root, fermented seed stock, and for the first time, a shared creation. Flame leaf paste blended with Zephyr morning pollen. They called it binding broth, and they wrote it down in the journal. The journal had become more than a recipe book now. Each page was a snapshot of them, flavor profiles, memory-infused meals, sketches of the garden, fragments of conversation. At the back, Keith had taped in the barcode from Leora's broken collar. She hadn't asked him to, but she hadn't removed it either. That evening, after dinner and a brief wrestling match with Forksy over tea-steeping temperatures, they sat outside the dome with their backs against the warm side of the generator casing. The sky had deepened into a molten lavender, stars bleeding in at the edges. Keith reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny glass vial. Inside was a single Zephyr petal, preserved in biogel. "I found this in the kitchen drawer," he said, "from the first night." Leora's fingers brushed his as she took it. "I thought I'd lost it. I almost threw it away. Thought it was just debris." "It was part of my travel cloak," she said. "It fell when you untied the trap." She turned the vial slowly in her hands, eyes distant. Then she looked up. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say in moments like this," she said quietly. "In my culture, when you reach the point of shared ground, you perform a vow of return. But there's no ritual here, no priest, no official tree to bind us to." Keith leaned closer, gently cupping her cheek. "You're here. I'm here. That's more sacred than half the rituals I've ever seen." She pressed her forehead to his. "Then let me say this in your language. I'm listening. You gave me something no one ever did. Not food, not shelter, but the space to be, to rebuild without questions, To change without guilt. You didn't save me. You just let me live. Keith swallowed, his voice tight. And you reminded me that taste isn't about memory or fame or technique. It's about who you cook for. About watching someone fall in love with flavor again. Forksy interrupted over the comms. Emotional dialogue approaching critical saturation. Shall I engage sentimental override? Keith didn't break eye contact with Leora. No, he said softly. Let it run. Leora reached into her robe and removed something new. A folded slip of paper made from pressed Zephyr bark. She handed it to Keith. He opened it. At the top was a single phrase, written in 2 languages. We're the recipe. Below it was a sketch, her soul seed, his first burned root cake, and the dome, flanked by sunlight and glowing vines. He looked up at her. She kissed him, firmly, this time without hesitation. When they pulled apart, she rested her head against his shoulder. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Me neither. The stars kept coming. And somewhere out there, far beyond the reach of this quiet moon, the galaxy spun on, loud and bright and ruthless. But inside this dome, everything had slowed. Everything had settled. 2 lives, once broken, once hunted, now folded together in something not perfect, but real. In something cooked slowly with intent. Love, after all, was just another flavor. And theirs had finally come to a boil. Days had passed, though neither Keith nor Leora seemed to count them anymore. Life had settled into something soft and warm, something neither of them had known they were missing. There were no more alarms, no drones overhead, no coded warnings hidden in spices or silence. Just the slow rhythm of 2 people who had built a home, not out of walls or wall screen recipes, but out of shared mornings, mismatched laughter, and the comfort of being fully seen. On this particular day, the weather was perfect, clear and still, with a light breeze curling through the garden like a curious animal. Zareth, 9 rarely offered stillness. But today, even the wind was gentle. Leora had risen early, her footsteps almost soundless as she moved around the dome. She was humming, as she often did now, those small, airy Zephyr melodies that Keith never quite remembered but always recognized. When Keith emerged from their sleeping nook, hair tousled and shirt wrinkled, she was already at the counter, cutting twist root into paper-thin slices. Morning, he said, yawning. You're late, she replied without turning. For what? For the celebration. Keith rubbed his face. We're celebrating something? Leora turned and handed him a small bowl of glittering green jelly. Today marks 1 full moon cycle since we began sharing recipes. He blinked. That's what you're tracking? She nodded, serious. It matters. Where I come from, cycles are sacred. They mark change, growth, commitment. Keith took the bowl, tasted the jelly, and smiled. Tastes like sweet moss and something else I can't place. Oh, she said. That's the secret ingredient. They spent the morning preparing a meal together. Her root spirals, his fireleaf glaze, and Forksy's constant sarcasm in the background. You've made a ceremonial lunch using 72% of our preserved food stores, the bot complained. 1 more cycle, and I'll be marinating myself in fuel out of protest. Keith ignored him. He's just mad because it downgraded his spice privileges. You shouldn't have let him program his own palate, Leora added. You made a monster. Correction, Forksy said. I was born a monster. You merely gave me flavor. By midday, the food was done and the dome smelled like something between a jungle wedding and a campfire feast. They carried everything outside, set up on a blanket in the garden, surrounded by stalks that reached for the sun like sleepy limbs. They ate slowly, feeding each other bites, not out of romance, but out of amusement. Leora smeared pollen paste on his nose. Keith retaliated with a spoonful of kelp foam directly to her cheek. Forksy hovered nearby, muttering about wasteful behavior, but still recorded every recipe alteration like it might save the universe. After they ate, they lay back in the grass, bellies full, sun warming their faces. Leora pointed at the sky. That cloud looks like a root beast. Keith squinted, more like a grumpy fork. She chuckled. You just see your robot in everything. I live with him. He's inescapable. She rolled on her side, propping herself up on one elbow. You know what I see when I look up now? He shook his head. Possibility. He turned to her, brushing a blade of grass from her cheek. What changed? You did, she said. Or maybe I did. Or maybe we both just stopped surviving and started living. Keith let the words settle before replying. I don't think I ever really lived before this. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and certain. When they pulled apart, their foreheads touched. Then let's never stop, she whispered. They stayed like that, tangled in the grass and the warmth of each other's breath, while the garden swayed around them and the stars slowly crept toward the edge of the sky. Later, as twilight dipped the horizon in soft gold, they sat on the edge of the dome with their legs dangling over the side, sipping warm herbal tea and writing the next page of their shared journal. They titled it, A Meal for No Reason. And underneath they wrote, Because sometimes the joy is reason enough. And on that quiet, golden evening on a forgotten moon, there was no war, no escape, no fear. Just two hearts, a little laughter, and the feeling that everything at last was exactly where it belonged.